This is a video I wasn't sure about making. On one hand, it might make me sound pretentious, but on the other, it's a topic I want to talk about because it might actually help some people. As evident from the title, it's going to be about how I've managed to become fluent in 3 languages, those being Croatian, my native language, German, and English by the age of 15, and how you can achieve fluency in a much shorter time frame. And while I dislike people talking too much before getting to the point in their videos, I'd first like to go over what I'll be discussing here, as well as give you some relevant background information on it, as it might help clear up some points. So firstly, I want to talk about what it means to become fluent in a language, and tell you how I personally went about doing so and the mistakes I've made along the way, and then finally give you my advice on how you should approach it. So what exactly does it mean to be fluent in a given language? Let's take a look at a definition first, and if you want to skip this part, there are timestamps below for it. According to the Cambridge Dictionary, fluency is defined by the ability to speak or write a language easily, well, and quickly. But the adverbs easily, well, and quickly here are somewhat subjective, because what someone considers easy can change from person to person, so it doesn't always mean the same thing, nor does it mean the same level of fluency. As an example, I'm a native Croatian speaker, so obviously I would consider myself fluent in Croatian just because I've lived in Croatia my whole life and it's the language I've used and been exposed to the most, but I'd also consider myself fluent in both English and German despite only ever spending a month in Germany and never being to an English-speaking country at all. You see, being fluent isn't a binary concept, there's different layers to it. Comparing the 3 languages here, I can comfortably say that in terms of general usage, Croatian would be the language I'm most fluent in, with German and English being about the same. What I want to show you with this is that being fluent doesn't mean being perfect at a language. Even native speakers make mistakes, including myself. A typical example for Croatian is the letters ch and ch. They both represent a similar sound, though the latter is a bit softer, but from where I'm from, we basically only use the ch variant, so it can be hard for me to sometimes write an uncommon word that has a ch in it, because I've always heard and said it with ch, which would theoretically then be a mistake. So when you're picking up a new language, you shouldn't strive for perfection, because as bad as it may sound, it's incredibly unlikely that you'll ever achieve it. Not impossible, but very unnecessary considering that you'll be getting diminishing returns as you study something for a very long time. So at the end of the day, I would personally consider someone fluent in a language not when they use it without mistakes, but when they are at a point where they can comfortably express their thoughts and ideas in that language. For Croatian, that might be arguing about how Nikola Tesla was Croatian, not Serbian, and vice versa. For English, it might be about how the UK definitely made the better choice by leaving the EU, and for German, it might be shit-talking people you know because the brand of beer you prefer the most is far superior to that of your friends. At this point, some of you might refer to various tests that grade the general level of your language as a good benchmark for how close to fluency you are, but I think those are bullshit. Let's take the Common European Framework of Reference, or CEFR test, as an example. According to their scale, acquiring a B2 certificate should mean that you are able to understand complex and abstract topics as well as produce detailed text on a wide range of subjects. But I know people who have a B2 certificate and they can't use the language at that level. Mind you, this might not apply to everyone, but at the end of the day, this is a test, and I'm sure many of you have experienced learning for a test just to forget most of it a day or two after. These tests are structured in a way that you can study specifically for them, but by doing so you tunnel vision on it without actually learning how to practically apply what you've learned in everyday life. I do believe that these tests can be useful when it comes to things like getting a job that requires a certain level of knowledge, or simply as a benchmark of where you are on your language learning journey, but the test itself shouldn't be your main goal, at least I believe so. And I'll use that as a segue into how I learn languages, because I've never even taken one such test by the time I became fluent in these 3. So, the method I use to learn a language is called acquiring comprehensible input, and it stems from something called the input hypothesis. Explained briefly, comprehensible input is learning by using, well, an input, and that could be reading, listening, watching TV or anime, or even playing video games, but the input needs to be just challenging enough to the point where you'll understand a fair bit of the input, and the things you don't know you will learn by proxy, or rather the context of what you're doing. To give you an example, if I say in German, meine Krankenversicherung ist abgelaufen und jetzt bleibt mir nichts anderes übrig, als mich schnellstmöglich bei meinem Arzt zu melden. You likely won't understand everything depending on your current level. However, if I say, ich esse einen Apfel, where we assume that you know that ich means I and essen means to eat, you can more easily realize that einen Apfel means an apple, or at least that it's some type of food. Combine this with images and it gets even easier. If there's a video of someone eating an apple and they say that line, it's not hard to put two and two together and figure out the meaning of the sentence. Now, I know this explanation wasn't the best, and there are numerous people out there, even on YouTube, who explained it far better than I did or I ever could, but I hope you get the gist of it. So how did I apply this as a kid when I started learning German, and sometime later English as well? For German, I simply watched a lot of cartoons. I was very young, about 4 years old, and cartoons were interesting to me, even though I didn't understand anything at first. By simply watching them for a very long time, and we're talking thousands of hours here, after all, acquiring language fluency is not a short process, I started to piece things together, and the more I understood, starting with the simple common words, the easier it became to add on to it. Rinse and repeat, and I got to where I am today. This isn't to say that cartoons are the only way of doing this. Again, the input can be anything that you prefer, and in fact it should be something you prefer, because if you enjoy doing it, you will stick with it for longer. Say you prefer reading to watching TV, no problem, but start with a book for children that uses simple language, then gradually move on to more difficult stuff. And this doesn't only help with learning vocabulary. Language is based on patterns, and those patterns always repeat in certain situations. The difference between them is their substance, or the words that you use, but the underlying skeleton of a sentence or expression is always there, and the more input you get that way, the easier it will become to recognize those patterns and to use them yourself. A possible downside of this may be that, while you'll know how to use a pattern, you won't understand it, but that's fine if you ask me. Most people don't want to be able to dissect the language they're speaking. Most natives sure as hell don't do it, but they still use it without issues because it just feels right at a certain point when you learn the language. And this is what I dislike about most, if not all, textbooks for language learning. The language they teach you is very robotic, for the lack of a better word, and you don't really use the language the way natives use it, which might develop some bad habits the longer you learn this way. Sure, you might get a deeper understanding of the aforementioned structure of what you're saying, but when you try to change the substance to fit your needs, it often doesn't sound good, it doesn't sound fluent at all, and while some people may learn languages well by using textbooks, they often hit a big hurdle when they are faced with real-life situations like talking to natives. For that reason, if your goal is to learn a language in a functional way, find a real-life input and use it. That's what I and lots of others have been doing, and the results show. As a matter of fact, you can do it much faster than I ever did, precisely because you aren't a young child anymore like I was when I started. There is this misconception that children learn languages faster, but that has been proven wrong. As an adult, you already know your native language, which you can then use as a reference point to more easily understand certain aspects of the new language you are trying to learn. The reason why many say children do it faster is because they don't really consider the amount of time and input those children receive. They're surrounded by their language 24/7, and after a few years they simply know it, and if you were in a similar situation right now, you would do it in a much faster time than they do, trust me. Finally, I'd like to give you some advice and show you some of the pitfalls I've experienced so you can avoid them. Firstly, the way I got my comprehensible input wasn't quite the best, because I started from a flat 0. This made the early stages extremely difficult because I needed a long time to really grasp anything that was being said or written. For that reason, I'd recommend you to first learn some basic vocabulary before you start. That might be the 100 most common words, maybe 500 or even 1,000, but no matter the amount, it will make the early stages a lot easier for you. To do so, I recommend using a program known as Anki, which is fairly popular and where you can find flashcard decks for most languages with an X number of common words. I am personally doing this as well right now because I'm learning Japanese. Secondly, you may choose any source of input really, but keep in mind that visual input often makes it easier to recognize certain words. Even though a house might have a different name in another language, if you see it, you'll still know it's a house. Also, while searching for the input, ideally, you should use something that's just challenging enough. If it's too hard, you won't learn much and you will lose motivation. If it's too easy, you won't learn anything new. However, something that's truly ideal likely doesn't really exist. So it's about striking a good balance and most of all, making sure that what you pick is something you enjoy doing. And at this point, I'll conclude the video. There's definitely more to talk about regarding this topic, and I might do so in the future, but the important takeaways here are that being fluent in a language doesn't necessarily mean that you use it perfectly and without mistakes, so don't worry about that too much because it might demotivate you in the long run. You shouldn't put too much focus on certificates and textbooks because they often don't reflect how the actual language is used, and that you should focus on comprehensible input as it will allow you to naturally acquire vocabulary and the patterns that are used within a given language. I hope that this video helped at least some of you, and if it did, consider subscribing and liking it. And also, please let me know in the comments what I could improve or whether there are some other topics you'd be interested in. Thanks for watching, and have a nice day.